When the Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on the Mexica capital, Tenochtitlan, they weren't just looking at a simple settlement. No, they were staring at a wonder that absolutely defied their imagination. A city of gleaming white temples and palaces that seemed to rise, almost impossibly, from the waters of a vast lake. It was grander, cleaner, and more orderly than anything they had ever known back in Europe. Canals were the streets, busy with thousands of canoes. Huge causeways, wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride side by side, connected it to the mainland. And all around were those famous floating gardens, the chinampas, producing this unbelievable bounty of food. But after a brutal 3-month siege, that dream was utterly shattered. The temples were rubble, the canals were clogged with debris and the dead. The most orderly city these Spaniards had ever seen was now just a landscape of total desolation. Our story begins in the silence, right after the war. With the victors back on the mainland, the survivors of Tenochtitlan faced the heartbreaking task of returning to what was left of their world. But what they found wasn't a home. It was a necropolis. Indigenous accounts from the time describe a horrifying scene. The water itself, the lifeblood of their civilization, was stained red, a constant reminder of the siege. Now the conqueror, Hernán Cortés, he had a choice to make. The practical, logical thing to do would have been to build his new capital on the firm ground of the mainland, in places like Coyoacán or Tacuba. But Cortés made a totally different, far more audacious decision. He chose to build directly on the ruins, on the unstable, swampy ground of the island. So the question is, why? Cortés wasn't just building a city. He was performing an idea. To a man of the European Renaissance, history was this grand story of one empire succeeding another. So to build upon the ruins, that was how you claim the very authority of the vanquished empire. It was a way to declare that a new Rome was rising from the ashes of the old. It was a statement that his dominion was absolute, physically stamped onto the very heart of the conquered world. The location was the message. But for all its talk of Roman grandeur, the New Mexico City wasn't born in triumph. It was born in paranoia. The very first designs weren't for a civilian capital at all, but for a military garrison, built to control a huge and potentially rebellious indigenous population. The Spanish were a tiny, tiny minority in a sea of conquered people, and they knew it. And think about this, the very first structure built in the new capital wasn't a church, it wasn't a government palace, it was the Atarazanas, a fortified naval base. It's a stunning fact that reveals everything. It was built to house the very warships, the brigantines, that had been so decisive in conquering the city in the first place. It tells us that the Spanish saw the lake not as a beautiful setting, but as a strategic asset, and crucially, as an escape route. The first thought wasn't how to live here, but how to get out if they had to. This fear was literally built into the architecture. The city council ordered that all the houses along the main causeway to the mainland be built as a single continuous wall, with no gaps. They called it the Casa Muro, the wall house. It was a fortified escape corridor. The city's design wasn't just about living there, it was about being able to get out, fast, by creating a defensible channel all the way to dry land. And the paranoia wasn't just directed outward. The historian Lucas Alamán points out that the conquerors themselves were a fractured rival response. Factions were constantly fighting over spoils and power. Cortés himself was always on guard for plots from his own men. So the city's rigid structure, its grid, was also designed to discipline the conquerors themselves, to impose some kind of order on a dangerous and unruly band of adventurers. So out of all this fear and ambition, a design emerged that would define the city's future conflicts. You have this rigid European ideal of order, the grid, the chessboard, being forced directly onto a fluid, untamable, aquatic environment. It was a collision of two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. And those first few decades were just a whirlwind of construction and control. In 1521, the choice was made. By 22, the grid was laid out, the perfect square of Spanish power. In 28, that architecture of fear was mandated. By 35, the imperial bureaucracy arrived, a sign that the era of the conquerors was ending. And then, in 1555, nature showed them the city's fundamental, terrifying flaw. And here you can see the two worldviews in direct opposition. The Mexica had built a city in harmony with the water. It was an amphibious metropolis, where canals were the arteries of life, and dikes were these sophisticated tools for managing water. The Spanish, on the other hand, saw the water as an obstacle to be conquered. They filled in canals to create solid streets for their horses and carts, imposing a land-based logic on an aquatic world and dismantling the ancient hydraulic systems without ever really understanding them. And in this year, the water responded. For 34 years, the Spanish had been building their dream of order. They'd laid out their perfect grid, built their stone fortresses, and truly believed they had mastered this new world. But they had forgotten about the power that lay just beneath their feet. Their carefully constructed European order was about to face a force it could not control. A catastrophic flood just inundated the city, and it lasted for years. The perfect chessboard became a murky swamp, and it was a terrifying revelation. The Spanish had conquered a people, sure, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the land itself. By breaking those ancient hydraulic systems, they hadn't tamed the environment. They had just made themselves incredibly vulnerable to its true power. The ghost on the lake wasn't just a memory, it was an active physical force. But despite this constant battle with nature, a complex human society was taking shape. Because Mexico City wasn't really one city. From the very beginning, it was two, a Spanish center and an indigenous periphery, locked in this relationship of segregation and total dependence. So you had the Spanish living inside the Traza, that central grid, in their fortified stone houses. This was the zone of political and commercial control, but surrounding them were the indigenous barrios, which often kept their traditional, more organic layouts, and even their own local leaders. These were the communities that provided the food from the Chinampas, the labor that actually built the new city, and all the essential services that kept the Spanish city alive. The Spanish core was an island, not just in a lake, but in a vast indigenous sea that sustained it. But of course, legal and spatial segregation could never prevent human interaction. In the markets, on construction sites, in kitchens, in bedrooms, the two populations mingled. And from this continual communication, as Alemán called it, a new hybrid mestizo society began to emerge. By the turn of the 17th century, the city looked like an unqualified success. After decades of fear and floods and instability, an era of imperial splendor seemed to have finally arrived. The city had found a kind of fragile equilibrium, a way of being. The poet Bernardo de Balbuena celebrated this new metropolis in his epic poem, The Grandeur of Mexico. He saw a city of perfect geometric order, a global hub of wealth where the silver of the Americas met the silks of China. In his eyes, it was the center of the world, a triumphant new Rome finally realized. To a visitor in 1604, it might have seemed like the ghosts of the past had been vanquished for good. And yet, this grandeur was built on an illusion. The triumph was a facade, because the fundamental conflicts that defined its birth were never actually resolved. They were just buried. Beneath those perfect chessboard streets, the ghost of the old city remained, in the soft soil that caused churches to sink. The memory of the old ways survived in the surrounding barrios, and beneath it all the waters waited, reminding the city with every single rainy season that its dominion was never absolute. You see, the story of Mexico City is one of transformation, not erasure. It was born from the ghost of another city, but that ghost never truly left. It lives on in the unstable ground we walk on, in the memory of the water, and in the very DNA of a culture built from that impossible mixture of two worlds. The questions of its birth are still being answered today, in every sinking colonial building, in every modern flood, and in the resilient, vibrant spirit of a city that lives and breathes and dreams on the foundations of its own magnificent, tragic past. Basta. This is Mexico. If something here opened a door, stay and subscribe. Basta is the second look. Mexico without the filter, without the shortcuts. New episodes every third day. See our suggested video in the box.